have joining us on the line our Gary Patterson. He's a native Tennessean with a passion for rock and roll. As a published author, Patterson's works portray many fascinating events that help shape musical history, from Robert Johnson through current groups making a place for themselves among rock and roll standing legends. Gary is the author of The Walrus Was Paul, Hellhounds on Their Trail, and Take a Walk on the Dark Side, Rock and Roll Myths, Legends, and Curses. Gary also gives lectures on college campuses concerning myths and little-known legends of popular music. He's also the host of Pop Odyssey Radio online at popodysseyradio.com, and his personal website is www.rgarypatterson.com, and he joins us right now on Spooky South Coast, one of our favorite guests. Good evening, Gary. Thanks for joining us.
Done this before, I believe.
Yes, we have on a few occasions, and it's still one of our most downloaded shows, one of our most listened to and most commented on shows. People just love talking about this stuff.
Well, I enjoy it myself. It's a good topic. It's interesting, I will say that.
Well, it seems that we're brought together here today under not so pleasant circumstances because of the death of Amy Winehouse. And I think anybody that followed her career and knew a little bit about her knew that this was not a surprise. This was kind of something that people saw coming a long time ago.
Well, sadly, it's like you're waiting for a car crash to happen. And, it's just going to be a matter of time. I think that her parents felt that way. And, it's really sad because, she was very, very talented. And to die as young as she did with a lot of great promise, I believe she was the only rock star who was 27 who had ever won 5 Grammys for an album, like Back to Black. So, she was very successful with it. She had her own demons. I know that on her last tour she had to cancel, which a few months ago, and she was booed off the stage, and she looked like she was getting back to her personal demons. I know her father was concerned, and it's just very tragic for anyone to die, especially when someone dies that young and the promise won't be as realized as it should be.
Well, I noticed that there was a YouTube video posted up of her joining her goddaughter on stage earlier this week, I think. And, she just looks the way that she's always looked. And I thought for a long time that maybe some of that was by design, that some of that was kind of her gimmick. But the more stories that I heard about her, the more it just seemed like she was destined to fall victim to these demons, as you mentioned. Yeah,
well, I agree with you. I know that I did a show with E called Doomed to Die 13 Curses. And one of the 13 curses has to do with rock stars dying at the age of 27. Imagine that. And when we did the show, at the end of that segment, they brought up 2 artists who were approaching 27 and may be the next members of the club. And, of course, well, one was Britney Spears, but it looks like she's got her act together. And then the second was Amy Winehouse. So, they had predicted it. I know there was a website that probably very not in good taste had actually had a contest to win something if you could predict when Amy Winehouse would die. And, to me, that's sort of extremely ghoulish. But, they've been doing the same thing on a death watch on Keith Richards, and Keith's still alive and well. I think there are a lot of rock stars are 10 foot tall or think they're 10 foot tall and bulletproof and have Keith Richards' metabolism, but that's not always the case. And, it's always a tragedy.
Well, when you look at some of these, rock stars that people are assuming are, have one foot in the grave, it's because of that lifestyle. It's that sex, drugs, and rock and roll lifestyle that they think are going to do them in. But maybe some people, a la Keith Richards, just have a higher constitution than the rest of us do.
Well, I think Graham Parsons would agree with that now, because there's a lot of people who knew that Graham Parsons was hanging out with the Stones and sort of adopted the lifestyle. It's good that Keith Richards is still with us, and he's a brilliant musician. But when you think of that, and if you see Keith, he's sort of ravaged face and from his own abuse, I guess. But the music's still there for him. It's amazing that in his late 60s, I guess, he's still out rocking and rolling in arenas, and the Stones still have music. So, that's great. And like I said, it's always a tragedy. But then again, it's nice that maybe they can come to their senses, because when you're on the road, you really believe nothing can hurt you. Mm-hmm. And when you're young, I guess that's the one thing. At 27, you're sort of leaving your youth, and you're crossing over to that one side where you're going to have to really make your career by this time because, the recording industry is not very, well, at 27, if you've not had an album, it's kind of hard to appeal to 12 and 13-year-old girls who actually buy the product. So I guess it's a time when you would have to reflect. I know that, if you take a look at numerology, 2 plus 7 is 9, and the number 9 is the only single digit multiplied by another single digit that will always equal 9. It's a number of completeness. There's 27 cycles they talk about in astrology, and that at the end of 27, it's supposed to be, the first 27 is supposed to be a great learning stage in your life, or a form of completeness. And I remember doing a thing with Coast to Coast with the Doors, and they were talking about reincarnation with the ninth cycle, and all this. So there has to be some spiritual and, I guess you would say some occult leanings to it or whatever. But, whatever reason it is, 27 is a very unlucky age for rock stars. And well, unfortunately today we have a new member of the club.
Well, and do you think that Amy Winehouse is, officially a member of that club, or is it just a coincidence? I mean, it seems like she's on that same destructive path that a lot of these people that we put in the 27 Curse Club were on. I mean, it's although the music's different, there's a lot of parallels to a Kurt Cobain, to a Jimi Hendrix, to Janis Joplin.
Well, a lot of times I think people say, well, to be mentioned as the club, you would really have to be a major, major artist. To somebody who could stand up to Brian Jones or a Kurt Cobain or a Jimi Hendrix or a Joplin or a Jim Morrison, that when they died, they had already been greatly successful. But, not every member of the club died of a drug overdose. Some accidental or suicide from depression. All of these things, it's not basically just a lifestyle. I know that when I wrote Hellhounds on Their Trail, which is the very first mention of the club in literature, I know that I could have said, well, what would be the odds that rock stars would die before the age of 30? So rock stars die before 30 is a great number. But if you take the number 27, and what I did, I excluded anyone who was in their 27th year. If I had added the 27th year, I could have had Otis Redding and Graham Parsons and a number of other artists, but I stayed true to 27. And, when I was on Coast, I had, with Ian Punnett, a good friend of mine, we got a call from, it was a person who was working on his Ph.D. in statistics, and he said, just for fun, that he took all the rock stars' ages when they died, which would start with Richie Valens, who was only 17, and he put them in his computer, and it spit out the results as that the number one age for the death of rock stars was 27, and there were 42 rock stars who died at that age. So now we can add 43. And I guess another thing I look at when I talk about rock stars dying at 43, or 27, the 43 rock stars, the one thing I don't do is I don't take side people who were in a band who played maracas or whatever, because then the list would be very overwhelming. I try to keep it to artists who actually made significant changes in the genre. And, if you think about it, 43 people who died at the age of 27 in rock and roll, it's the number one age for the death of rock stars of all ages. So whatever there is, if there was something unleashed by Robert Johnson who died at 27 and is packed with the devil at the crossroads, as legend claims, then maybe it still reaches out and touches a number of artists, because Robert Johnson also had his own personal demons. If you remember the story, he had taken some whiskey, and it had been mixed with strychnine, and it took him 3 days to die on his hands and knees howling like a dog at the age of 27. And he became fascinating for artists like Eric Clapton and Keith Richards and Jimmy Page. And I think the legend turned him on to the music. So the one good thing is, when you die at 27, you die at your peak. And at 27, you become almost immortal. It's almost like ancient Greek. When a great hero died, he became a demigod. Well, we still turn on the radio, you're going to hear Jim Morrison loving her madly. And you're still going to hear all these artists. So they're trapped forever at the age of 27.
What's especially strange about it, though, is when you look at some of these accomplished musicians and what they were able to do before they turned 27. I mean, I know by the time I was 27, I'd started this program, I'd had my son and gotten married and started a writing career, but it pales in comparison to what some of these other people have done. It's almost like everything that they have to give, they give so much and so soon that maybe it's just all that is sucked out of them by the business, and by the time they're 27, there's nothing left.
Well, you may have a point there. I know that. Just think of the life, the experience they put in 27 years, how they live life. It reminds me, and I know that you teach language arts like I do in literature, and it reminds me of the Romantic poets. If you remember, you had Byron, who died at 35. You had Shelley, who drowned at 29, and you had Keats, who died at 25. And you compare those three writers, the Romantics, with William Wordsworth, who lived to be 80. But at the age of 40, Wordsworth really didn't create one other great poem. So he had 40 years of nothing. It just seems like in the case of Keats, when he found out he was dying, he had 1 year left because he was a doctor. He had tuberculosis. He knew that he had 1 year to write everything he had. When you read When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be, you can see it. So he wrote everything out in that 1 year. He put it all on paper. And he wrote the 5 greatest odes in the history of the English language at the age of 25 because he knew he was dying. Rock stars who died at the age of 27 have had great accomplishments for whatever guided them, whatever creativity they had that fostered the light that burned. Obviously it burned them out. But, the life that they lived in those 27 years is very significant compared to people who've yet to create a tenth of the work they did in those short years.
I do.
That's actually points to one of the things that I was thinking about as we were talking this afternoon, Gary, is that, I wonder if we then take a look at some of the other great music that's been made, how many artists changed dramatically after the age of 27? So they didn't necessarily die, but they became almost a different person. A lot of people's musical beliefs and kind of their approach switches dramatically. I wonder how many of those we can look back and track it in their 27th year. They became something different.
Well, that'd be an interesting thing to consider. I mean, I can think right now that Linda Ronstadt changed completely. Of course, I don't think she was 27 when she made the change. But, there are artists. You take something as far as you can take it, and then you set it down. Someone else takes it up, they take it further. And then what you do is you go back and you reconfirm. If you look at the Beatles, for instance, look at the change they did, starting with Revolver, Sgt. Pepper's, and then they went back again. So, being creative and being able to have the flexibility to make the change. A lot of artists usually stay trapped in the same genre. With, it's like Keith Richards said, the songs of the Rolling Stones, man, we made a lot of money off 3 chords. But, it was the hooks and the way it was presented that keeps it going. So there really wasn't a great deal of total change. But you're right, there's a lot of artists who made great change and they went on. I mean, didn't Mozart have 27 compositions when he died? Something like that. I mean, every time I see the number 27 in a piece of literature or I hear about it, it just brings it back. But you're right, there were changes in artists' life, and it'd be a good study to find out how old they were when those changes came about.
When you look at the list, and I pulled up a list here online of some of the causes of death, and you mentioned it's not all drug overdoses.
Right.
Some of them are just really strange. I mean, Les Harvey of Stone the Crows died by electrocution from a live microphone in his wet hands.
Yep.
And on Halloween of 1968, we had Malcolm Hale from Spanky and Our Gang dying from carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty space heater. If you want to say, okay, you can only do drugs and drink alcohol for so long before it takes its toll, and 27 might just be a coincidental number, that's one thing. But when you look at this, it makes me go back to that Robert Johnson curse. How many different ways, and it's almost like they're especially dastardly, especially in some ways almost an evil overtone to the way that they die.
Or exactly like a fluke. My gosh, who would do this? How would that happen? It's almost like watching the movie Final Destination.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's going to happen. It's going to happen in a unique way. But you're right. I mean, being electrocuted on stage, things like that. I mean, it wasn't all brought about by excess. Of course, what does Blake say? The road to excess leads to the palace of wisdom. In some cases, I guess it doesn't catch on to the wisdom, as far as excess goes. And I guess, you may be trapped as a child because if you're a fabulous artist, you're going to be babied all the way up. You're going to be told you're the greatest. You're going to be put out on the road and playing those performances and riding in small planes and taking buses. I mean, those would really increase the likelihood of an accident as opposed to, just being a normal lifestyle. So I can understand the argument that, it's a coincidence based upon their lifestyle. I can understand that, but as you look at it, you say, my gosh, this is almost out of a Stephen King novel, how they died.
Is there some possibility maybe that as we've talked about this 27 Club and it's become more prominent in our discussion of the history and the myths and curses of rock and roll, that maybe it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy for a lot of these artists as they reach their 27th age?
I know a lot of them have a lot of anxiety when they reach 27. I know that John Mayer was interviewed in a BMI Writers magazine, and one of the questions they asked him, they said, what do you consider your greatest accomplishment? And he looked and he said, well, I made it past 27. So if you're an artist, I think it weighs on the back of your mind. So my advice is, when you turn 27, stay home, take a year off, stay out of the bathtub with your electric guitar, don't take anything stronger than a bare aspirin, and maybe you'll make it to 28 and beat the curse.
Are there any other, similar ages where this has happened, where we can look at a number of artists? 'Cause I can't think of any, that they we know around the age of 40 we've lost Elvis, we've lost John Lennon, but I don't think there's any other number that stands out in my mind where there's maybe 2 or 3 artists who have died at the same age.
Yeah, just a few, but nothing like 27. I mean, at first I thought, well, let's look at 33, because, 3 times 3 would be 9. And Bon Scott was 33, and you can find a few other artists, but, that would be really coincidental. And, I know a lot of people are going to look at this and are going to say, wow, this is going to be coincidental. So I'll make a prophecy for you. I noticed that when Amy died, that it's on the web, they talk about the club, Curse of 27, and somebody's going to notice, yeah, but look at her last name, Winehouse. It has 9 letters, okay? And then they're going to say that if you look at her mother's name was Janice, but she spelled it Janis. And that's a very unusual spelling because it's the same spelling that Janis Joplin used in her name. And, of course, Joplin was a troubled individual, too, who was much like Amy Winehouse. And then Amy's best friend was in a television show in England called Big Brother. Well, what was Janis Joplin's backing band? Big Brother and the holding company. So do you have all these strange parallels? Is that a coincidence, or is it, some sort of idea that sort of God has a sense of humor and he wonders if we catch on? But, the whole thing is, it's just really strange. And I know that when I do Coast to Coast with George Norrie, we talk about the word coincidence. Well, maybe the best definition of a coincidence is an explanation waiting to happen.
Yeah. Well, I think that when you look at all these varieties of factors, if you're Amy Winehouse, you've got to kind of smack yourself in the face as you get closer to 27 and say, I can't live my life this way. I can't. There are all these maybe coincidences, but maybe signs. Maybe I should really get myself in. And it seemed like every attempt that she made to do that, we always heard that she was going to rehab and she was going to clean herself up, and it never seemed to take. You would think with that staring you in the face, unless you wanted it to happen, you'd fight it with tooth and nail.
Well, what you just said was interesting, because you said if you wanted it to happen. It's almost like a suicidal lifestyle. I know that she was greatly depressed with the breakup of her longtime boyfriend. And, the depression that comes with that obviously leads to more experimentation with drugs, to try to escape the pain, the inward thing. And so maybe that's what it is. I think that you can choose a lifestyle that can be destructive. And there are a number of artists that had that lifestyle and is living on the edge. And then what does Neil Young say? It's better to burn out than fade away.
Absolutely.
And I would consider this burning out.
Well, I would say too. Speaking of Neil Young, he's there's that book that's out now by David Brown, Fire and Rain, where they look at the year 1970 and the effect that it had on music. And that was the year that Jimi Hendrix, of course, passed away. And they talk about Hendrix kind of on a downward spiral in that year before he died on September 18th. And it seems like, Amy Winehouse was probably following a similar path in that. We saw the same thing with Kurt Cobain, where, first he had the stomach problems and he was taking himself off tour. So it's not like it should come as a really big surprise when you see them going through all of this. I can't believe that, although, managers, handlers, all the people that are there making their living off this person as an artist, they want them to keep going. They want everything to stay status quo. But the fact that family can't intervene enough, that family can't supersede some of these, I don't want to say leeches, but some of these, music industry people who are more invested in the ongoing name than the actual person. Because, look at Tupac Shakur's, Red Label, his handlers, his manager. They probably made more money off of him dying than they did when he was alive.
Well, it's like Jimi Hendrix said, it's funny how people love the dead. Once you're dead, you're made for life. Well, who's made for life? Whoever owns the publishing to the artist. All right? If you look at Hendrix, when you look at him at Woodstock, the Isle of Wight, all those performances, he was extremely depressed. And, he even walks off at the Isle of Wight and says, man, we just can't get it together, and just walks off the stage. Tuesday night, we've got on Pop Odyssey Radio, we're going to have a interview with Jamal Sultan, who was percussionist with Jimi Hendrix at Woodstock and also the Rainbow Bridge. And I'm going to have some interesting questions for him because, I've always believed that Hendrix didn't die from asphyxiation. I honestly believe that Jimi Hendrix was murdered. And, I have some strong reasoning behind it. I know that he wanted to leave his manager, Mike Jeffrey, and had already signed a deal with another manager. And if Jeffrey lost his cash cow, then he would be ruined, especially after borrowing hundreds of thousands of dollars from organized crime to build Electric Ladyland Studios. If he didn't produce the money, then he would be killed. So when Hendrix died and Eric Burdon goes on the radio and says that Hendrix just killed himself to take his way out, Jeffrey was furious because if Hendrix had committed suicide, the insurance policy he had either of $1 to $2 million wouldn't have paid. But we know that before Hendrix died, he had been kidnapped. He had been rescued by Mike Jeffrey a few days later. We know that when he went into Canada, that the border guards discovered heroin in his suitcase that Hendrix believed was planted by Mike Jeffrey, and a message to tell him that he could get him anytime he wanted. Now, what makes me think it's murder, and I've always thought this, was that when Hendrix was taken to the hospital, the doctor says that wine was oozing out of his mouth, and that he had a suction device to take the wine from his throat. But still, there was so much wine in his lungs that he was, it looked like he'd been drowned in wine. But when they did the blood test, there was very little alcohol in his bloodstream, which means that he was dead before the alcohol was able to go into the bloodstream.
Mm-hmm.
And now one of his roadies has come forward and said that he heard Jeffrey confess that he had Hendrix take 9 sleeping pills, or he had 2 of his henchmen come in, hold Hendrix down, give him 9 sleeping pills to paralyze his throat so that he couldn't, that he would not be able to throw up the wine, and poured 2 large bottles of red wine down his throat into his lungs. And Hendrix's friends will tell you that he did not like red wine. And then the strange case with Monica Daneman, his girlfriend, who was the one who called the police in London, when she found his body, instead of calling 999, which is the emergency number in England, she calls Eric Burdon. The ambulance wasn't called for like 30 minutes. She said that Jimmy was alive when they put him in the ambulance, and that he asphyxiated because the ambulance drivers didn't have his head positioned correctly. Well, that's all wrong. And a lot of people did not know that the doctor and the ambulance drivers had never been interviewed. This was just Monica Daneman's story. So you want to talk about a strange curse? When Hendrix died, his main girlfriend, Devon Wilson, who he wrote Dolly Dagger for, A few weeks later, jumped off the top of the Chelsea Hotel in New York, committed suicide. Monica Daneman, the girl he was living with, takes a hose to the back of her muffler and runs it into the car and asphyxiates herself in carbon monoxide. Noel Redding, when he died, always believed Hendrix had been murdered. Now, Mike Jeffrey was coming back from Spain to answer questions in England, and the plane blew up. Jeffrey's body was never found. Jeffrey used to work for MI6. There are people who believe that he had actually put his luggage on the plane and didn't board it, blew the plane up to give him the perfect cover so he wouldn't be arrested. So you talk about a strange story. When you brought up Jimi Hendrix, had to bring that up because we're going to find out that he did not asphyxiate as the story goes. And it was murder. So we'll see if they reopen it, but it's a strange story.
Absolutely, it is, and there are so many strange stories associated with so much of the 27 Club. And if you can stay with us for a little bit longer, Gary, we do have to take a break for the news. We're required to run the network news of about a 5-minute break, but if you can stay with us for a little while longer, I'd like to talk to you some more about some of these people in the 27 Club.
Okay, it'd be great. Sure.
All right, and of course, you'll be on Coast to Coast a little bit later on many of the stations around the country and around the world, talking, I assume, with Ian Punnett?
That's right. Ian's a good guy.
We'll
have fun there, too.
All right, so we'll take a break for the news. When we come back, we'll talk more with Gary Patterson. We'll have Chris Balzano with us for some more questions. We'll also have the phone lines open, 508-996-0500, 1-877-996-1420. You can also email us spookycrew@spookysouthcoast.com, and if you want to text in a question, you can do so at 508-444-2661. So a lot of different numbers to remember. I feel almost like George Norrie having to announce all these different phone numbers here. But there are all those ways to get a hold of us, and we'll continue the discussion coming up. So, again, if you have any questions, 508-996-0500, 1-877-996-1420, or you can text them in at 508-444-2661. We'll take a break for the news. When we come back, we'll talk more about the 27 Club, the death of Amy Winehouse. Again, she was found today in her London apartment, dead at the age of 27. She's now part of the infamous Forever 27 Club. And we'll talk more about that with our guest, R. Gary Patterson, coming up in just a few minutes. And our special guest tonight is R. Gary Patterson. You know him from his works, such as The Walrus Was Paul, Hellhounds on Their Trail, Take a Walk on the Dark Side, Rock and Roll Myths, Legends, and Curses. We're talking tonight about the 27 Club. Amy Winehouse, unfortunately, is the latest member. Gary, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Pop Odyssey Radio, because that's something that you started since the last time we had you on your program. How's that going?
Oh, it's going well. Have a great time. If you'd like to listen in, it's on every Tuesday and Thursday night. And on the Eastern Time Zone, it'll go from 9 p.m. until 11 p.m. And we try to bring on a lot of guests in pop culture, a lot of rock artists. We got Jamil Sultan, who's going to be on Tuesday night, who was with Hendrix. And I want to try to get some of the great stories about Jimi Hendrix out on this. And, I mean, he was with him, especially he was playing in his band. He's on a number of recordings, and we've had a lot of fun, and we have some of the paranormal, too. My partner's name is Steve Wren, and also a partner, Christian Dion, who's probably one of the greatest psychics I've ever met. He actually predicted that Amy Winehouse would pass away several months ago and made the prediction, and I thought, well, you know, I can sort of see how you would think that she would be the next one in the club, you know, because of the lifestyle, like Keith Richards. But, you know, they've had Keith Richards on a death watch for 5 years, and he's still going strong. So, but still, you know, it's been fun for us. And right now I'm working on a couple of television things I hope take off. I've got a producer from HBO talking to me. So hopefully you'll see me back on television before too long.
Oh, that would be excellent. One thing that I was thinking about during the news break is, you know, now that Amy Winehouse has joined this 27 Club, I can't really think of somebody else who we have to be concerned with, who we can consider as on that path. I mean, a lot of the younger artists of today, they seem to more or less have maybe learned the lesson, or maybe it's a different culture and they're not drawn toward a lot of those excesses that others have been caught up in.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. And, you know, like I said before, you know, the road to success leads to the palace of wisdom. Maybe not necessarily in the person who demons took his life or her life, but maybe from other artists who said, this is not how I'm going to end up. The way I got the title for the club, or the 27 Club, was when Kurt Cobain died. his mother, in a Time magazine article, said, now he's gone and joined that stupid club. I told him not to join that stupid club. And that made me think, wow, the club, 27, membership, age 27, and instant death, but instant immortality and fame. The sad thing is there's a lot of artists who would say, hey, if I die young, then, I'll be a legend. Remember The Who? I hope I die before I get old.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess two of them are still here, who are old and they didn't pass away, with Townsend and Daltrey. But it was that sort of that mindset. James Dean, the cool image of rock and roll: live fast, die young, leave a good-looking corpse. The whole thing. So, I guess it's what you want to risk: instant immortality, or an artist who gets so old and outdated they doesn't matter. But when you die young, your music's always going to be going strong. And the main question is, what would he be doing if he had lived? I mean, how many times do you hear
earlier
that with
about that so many of the artists that we look to, whether they're musicians or writers or artists, they create what they create that's the greatest and that's most kind of with us after they die when they're young. And every year that I get older, I have to check off the people who have accomplished more than I have by my age. But it's true that the list of people who started producing great things after the age of 30 is short, and the people who continuously created great things after the age 30, age 40, age 50, gets less and less each time. So there is something romantic in an artist's soul about you create the greatest things when you're young.
Well, that's true. I mean, exactly like we talked about the romantic poets. I mean, it goes into the whole thing with that, to create your greatest element when you're young. I know Wordsworth said that a poet really couldn't be a great poet if he hadn't done a great work by the age of 21, And so, I mean, the idea of the power of youth and the power of that expression does play a role in it. I do know that. But, we talk about learning, from excess. You got to remember that sometimes your membership in the club doesn't have to come from a drug overdose. It could come from some bizarre accident that we talked about. So, there's no one today that I can look at and say, yep, this person's destined for membership. I always had that strange, uncomfortable feeling with Amy Winehouse, though. And I remember when we did the thing with E, when I saw that they'd put her on the list and they said she'd better be careful. At that point, it was just like watching a car wreck. I always hoped that, she would have the strength or the I don't know, I guess the determination to get her career going and beat it, and that's what makes it a tragedy. But, personally, I hope there's never another member of the club, and
absolutely.
That's what I hope. Sadly, I know that that's not going to be the case. And I know that when someone passes away and they're 27, there are people say, well, that's just a strong coincidence. But sometimes I wonder, when you see a list of 43 names and when Amy Winehouse died, the first thing they said was she was 27. Every time I hear that, it's just like a cold chill, like a ghost story, and I know that there's been another initiation into the club.
Well, not to make you feel morbid here or anything, Gary, but when I was watching music videos on one of the music channels, and I saw the breaking news scroll come down at the bottom of the screen that said Amy Winehouse dead at the age of 27. As soon as I saw that 27, my first thought was of you.
Yeah.
And I immediately texted Chris and said, do you think we can try to get Gary on the show tonight? Because, we have to talk about this. But unfortunately, you've become the face of the 27 Club, which you probably didn't want to have happen.
No, I mean, I thought it was a cool story, and I thought it was just something that you'd say, oh, my gosh, that maybe there's something to this. A great urban legend, a great myth, and I guess I have become the face of it, but, it's just, I don't know. It's just such a tragedy, and like I said, to die young is a double tragedy because then the rest of your life is what might have been. She was 27, what would she do? But, we talked about the money being made off this. Okay, how many artists who died at the age of 27 are still having releases? Jimi Hendrix's sister said that they could turn out album after album for 6-7 years of all the stuff that's in the studio. So no wonder someone hears Tupac and they say he's got to be alive because this album just came out. Or Hendrix, Valley of Neptune, he's got to be, listen to this. This stuff's still coming out. So, there's so much recording that's been kept locked away in the studios, owned by labels, and they're just waiting for the right time to release it. So I guess in that way, you can die at 27 and be dead for 10 years and still make the record company lots of money.
Absolutely. They still have that cash cow there because I think when a lot of these artists, subconsciously feel they might be joining that club, they're in there cranking it out a la Tupac. He recorded more in the last, I think they said he was in the studio like nonstop the last year and a half of his life because he kind of had a sense that his time was going to be short.
Yeah, you remember his video, I Ain't Mad at You?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, he goes into rock and roll heaven, at the end of it, the gangland shooting thing. I mean, sometimes you have these eerie premonitions, I guess. I just remember that when Buddy Holly died, his last song was called, I Guess It Doesn't Matter Anymore. And, I guess, that's kind of strange, And if you take a look at Biggie Smalls and Tupac, their albums also had sinister ideas of maybe they knew what was happening. But, as long as product can be put out, and it's good for fans. I mean, Jimi Hendrix died in 1970 in September of 1970, and he's got Valley of Neptunes that comes out. So you get to still hear the incredible talent of an artist that you can say, well, this is something I haven't heard. It's not like a complete re-release of all the greatest hits. It's always something cool to listen to. So I guess in that way, it's good. But I think a lot of people, like with the Tupac thing, I remember Tupac is Alive, went through all that for a while. And see, Tupac is alive, Paul is dead, and Elvis is alive. So it gets to be complicated, but it's all about the music.
Well, I want to thank Elvis for that Whopper he made me the other day. It was awesome. But one of the artists that I've always had a strange feeling in my stomach about, you look at a guy like Elvis, a guy like Jim Morrison, these guys, if they were still around, we probably would have heard something from them by now. You would have to think somebody would have spilled the beans. Even an Andy Kaufman, by now we would have heard something for sure. But one person that's always kind of stuck out in my mind a little bit is Kurt Cobain, not faking his death, but just the circumstances that have been reported to us. I don't really buy the whole story. I think there's more to it than that, because if you remember, just prior to, a few months before his suicide, I think it was in September of the year before, he was hospitalized in Rome with stomach pains. And this was something that we heard frequently, that he was undergoing stomach pains, and therefore he was unable to perform, and they canceled some shows. And I started to wonder myself if maybe he was suffering from some kind of stomach cancer, which, as anybody that's gone through it will tell you, it's one of the most painful ways that you can die, and then it's utter just destruction of your entire body. And I wonder if maybe he knew that was maybe a medical diagnosis, and he decided to just take care of things himself ahead of that.
Well, of course, Tim, heroin has that same
that's true too.
same impact on your stomach. So
that's true too.
Well, I know Ian Halpern, and he wrote the book Who Killed Kurt Cobain,
mm-hmm.
and we've had some interesting shows on that. I do know about the stomach issue that he had, and sometimes a lot of artists can plan their own exit, and it's like Neil Young, like we talked about, it's better to burn out than fade away. But, there's so many strange things with the death of Kurt Cobain, with the death of Brian Jones, with the death of Jimi Hendrix, and conspiracies are always going to exist unless everyone is convinced that, it's been a fair evaluation. And, there's so many questions about Kurt Cobain's death. I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing it reinvestigated. At least you can answer the questions. And the idea that there were no fingerprints on the shotgun, that's kind of concerning. The other thing is, Kurt Cobain was not very tall. And how could he lie on the floor and take a shotgun and put it in his mouth and pull the trigger with his finger? Most people who commit suicide with a shotgun use their toe. And then the case of his credit card, when his body was found, I think he was in the room for like 2-3 days before they found his body, and his credit card had been taken and was used. And as soon as they announced his death, someone stopped using the credit card. And, whatever happened in Seattle for about a year after that, there were a number of artists who died strange deaths, like Kristen Pfaff from Hole, who died of a heroin overdose, even though her boyfriend, who was with her at the time, said that she had never used the drug. But yet, she died there, and she was worried about Kurt Cobain's death. So, until we get an investigation and it covers all this, it's almost like, you may not remember this, but when Oswald killed Kennedy, there was some misinformation on the autopsy form, like his eyes were a different color, all of this. And it took a number of years before they actually dug up Oswald's body to see, let's see if it's true. The same thing with Zachary Taylor. A rumor went around that Henry Clay had poisoned him. So hundreds of years after his death, Zachary Taylor was brought up, re-examined, and they found a small trace of arsenic in his hair, but they said that was probably common from the medicines at the time. And now I think they're doing Clark from Lewis and Clark expedition, that he may have been murdered. They did Kingfish's murderer, Carl Weiss, in Louisiana, and now they're digging these people up who've been dead 100 years or more, trying to find out what the truth is. So who knows? Maybe they'll look again at Kurt Cobain and Brian Jones and Jimi Hendrix and a few others to see what the truth is.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Kristen from Hole and Kurt Cobain, because there is the interesting link between the two of them, that being Courtney Love. And I don't think we're breaking any new ground here to say that the finger has been pointed at her numerous times in the past, because nobody benefited from Kurt's passing more than Courtney Love and her own career did.
Well, what you'd have to do is take a look. First of all, there's a lot of people believe that Kurt Cobain wrote the first Hole album, and that he actually provided the music. And Billy Corben did the second one, I believe. And after Kurt's death, it seems like Hole wasn't putting out any outstanding music to make the band a great legendary group. And the people who believe that Courtney may have had something to do with it, it always comes to the idea she must have been very lucky, because if Kurt Cobain was divorcing her, I mean, on the suicide note, Ian Halpern and some of the experts who've looked at it say that there's actually two sets of handwriting. Well, let's investigate it. Let's find out if there is. But if Kurt Cobain had divorced Courtney, then she'd probably receive a few $100,000. But if he died and she was married to him, then she would inherit all the royalties of all the songs he wrote for Nirvana, which would be millions and millions of dollars. So I know Tom Grant, the detective who's looked into this, I know that he would say that, that's probable cause, to look into it, because she would have so much to gain. Now, I'm not saying she had anything to do with it at all, but I'm saying that you're going to hear these rumors, so, why not reinvestigate? Why let these things build up? And, I mean, this Kurt Cobain thing will be going on for 10 more years, especially the anniversary of his death. So, you have believers. You have people who believe Elvis is alive. I mean, he fixed you a hamburger today, right? So, I mean, on Elvis's centennial birthday, his 100th birthday, people are going to be wondering when Elvis is going to appear. I mean, now there's even a rumor that, Elvis did fake his death, but he died in 1997, 20 years later. And you talk about Jim Morrison. Hey, I've had phone calls from Oregon that Jim's living on a ranch up there, and he's raising horses, and you can buy videos from Jim Morrison showing how his face morphs back to the original Jim in the early 70s, and you can buy it, and then this movie goes in, or money goes in to finance a film. I mean, I've talked to Gerald Pitts, and you hear this, and if you really want to have a strange story to show how significant it is, it's Elvis and Morrison seem to have more offspring, more brothers, more sisters, more children who come forward claiming part of the legacy. I know at least 3 people who claim to be the sons of Jim Morrison. All right, one even has a band, and trying to go before the Morrison estate, trying to have DNA tests proven. I know Jim's brother-in-law, Alan Graham, he sort of fights against that. Of course, he got really duped once and actually had proclaimed that this guy was Jim Morrison's son, and then found out it was all wrong. So, it's easy to see this, but, I mean, when you're a legend, when you die young, every time you turn on your radio and you hear them, they're always with us. And maybe that's the greatest thing to say. If you even die at 27 and you become a member of the club, the music is staying with us, and the music will always, they'll always live through their music and their compositions.
And like you said, you can be a great artist, chugging along with these hits in your 20s, and you might not even be hitting what might be your peak, when you realize there's more to life than just partying, and you can really get into some of the, the heavier things. I just imagine what a guy like Jim Morrison would have been able to write in his 30s, or a guy like Kurt Cobain would have written in his 30s. But instead, they're forever frozen in time at that age, but they do get that automatic, push from just a great artist to a legend. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of these people that were headed toward legendary status anyway, but, how often is it that somebody like Amy Winehouse would get put into the same comparisons as Jimi Hendrix, Kurt Cobain, Jim Morrison? I mean, I guess, I could see a lot of Janis Joplin comparisons for her, even if she had lived past 27, but instead, it's kind of like you become part of that special elite, as Stephen King wrote, they got a hell of a band.
Yeah, that's exactly it, from rock and roll heaven. And they've got one hell of a band. We'll give the Righteous Brothers a little credit for that, too.
Sure, yeah.
But, you're right, and if you take a look at their pictures, I mean, how many portraits, how many pictures do you see that are licensed from Jimi Hendrix and James Dean and Marilyn Monroe and Elvis Presley when he was young? I mean, they're frozen in time. The other thing is you'll never hear a bad song by them. After they die, everything's a great hit. Mm-hmm. And, you don't see them fail. I think the Beatles were afraid of that because when they started doing, when they did Revolver and it changed everything more into psychedelic, when Sgt. Pepper came out, it was a complete shift in the Beatles. I don't know if they thought it would be successful. Maybe that's why the Paul is Dead rumors started on Sgt. Pepper's, really putting them in there with the bass drum and all that. Because, the Beatles kept changing, evolving, and it actually destroyed them. Because after Sgt. Pepper, there was no way they could perform that on stage. They didn't have the technology. They couldn't bring in the orchestras. And that's when they went back to the White Album, and they went back to Abbey Road, which were fabulous albums. But I remember a Beatle fan monthly saying, the Beatles owe it to their fans to continuously keep breaking new ground. Well, who has taken music any further than the Beatles?
True. Well, wasn't that decision with Sgt. Pepper, though? Didn't they want to try to experiment as much as they can?
Because
they had no plans to return to the stage? or
Right. Well, they didn't want to play live because what happened in the Philippines where they snubbed the Marcos family and the Filipino army came after them, and they had to run on the tarmac to get on the plane to leave. And Alf Bicknell, who was the road man, he was their chauffeur and helped with the road management, told me that they actually called out for Brian Epstein and Mal Evans to come out of the plane, and they thought they were going to be killed. So Mal turns to Alf and says, "Tell my wife I love her." And when they got off the plane, the commander took their briefcase with all their money because they were paid in cash. So when the plane finally took off and the Beatles survived, George turned to the other Beatles and he said, it's not fun being a Beatle anymore. So they decided to put themselves in the studio and do that, changing, from Revolver to Sgt. Pepper's. And, of course, Magical Mystery Tour was songs left over from the Sgt. Pepper sessions. And, then, of course, you had Revolution 9, which was an experiment by Lennon, being very avant-garde, but they went back to what they did best. And, to me, I think Abbey Road's a fabulous album. I can hear Paul McCartney's side. I hear John Lennon's side. But, they did go back. But I think that, being that creative, no other band has matched them in creativity, even today. And, of course, as you know the story, what inspired Sgt. Pepper was the Beach Boys with Pet Sounds. So, you had two fabulous bands in the studio changing everything. I still think of Good Vibrations,
I was going to say, likewise, wasn't Pet Sounds inspired by Revolver?
I mean, they fed off each other. And I'm sure that Brian Wilson's breakdown, where he stayed in bed for a year and had his headphones on, listening to Sgt. Pepper's over and over again, wondering how he was going to top that, had some bad shoes. But, you had, and I can't remember another time in musical history we had that many changes. Now, if I could go back in time, we talked about 1970, I would go back to 67. I would go to Abbey Road Studios, and this would be sometime around January 60. Well, probably not January, sometime around maybe April of 67. And I would go into Studio 2 and Studio 3 because the Beatles were recording Sgt. Pepper's in Studio 2, and Pink Floyd was recording Piper at the Gates of Dawn in Studio 3. And I was just wondering what they were hearing coming down the hallway from each other.
a little bit of one-upmanships, maybe.
Let's use this sound. This is cool. Let's use this sound. And, I just thought that was great. 67 was also Are You Experienced, that album, Cream's first album. And so 67 was a pretty big year, too. But, that would be a good time to visit, if you could hear that. But sometimes, being very creative and putting out so much material can actually destroy the band. And I think that's what happened with the Beatles. I think that that was one of the reasons they said we can't really push it any further. And, of course, Sgt. Pepper was the trademark, but also I think Abbey Road was actually the way to go out, even though Let It Be, which had been recorded earlier, was released last.
Well, a lot of artists, they say that everybody has one good album in them, and whether or not it comes out, it's not always the case. But Chris, not to disparage one of your all-time favorites, but you look at somebody like Alanis Morissette, who came out of the gates with just a phenomenal first album,
right,
and was never able to really duplicate the success of that. I can only imagine what it must be like when you are doing that on a consistent basis, when every album seems to be as heralded as that first one was for her. The pressure to keep up with that, it must make you realize that, hey, maybe I can't do it on my own. Maybe my own imagination isn't enough, and then so you reach for the bottle, or you reach for whatever else you're going to try to expand your mind beyond whatever limits you might feel that it has.
Well, I think you've put your finger on something, because that's why a lot of the old blues players got into heroin, and that's always been there. But if you also take a look at some of the great poets, how important was opium and laudanum? I can think of Coleridge, I can think of Poe, and I know a lot of artists use that to create some sort of inspiration, as the Beatles would have done with LSD when it first came out. So, sometimes taking, I guess what you'd say, illegal substances, whatever, to sort of spur your creativity would be something you do because of the pressure that would be involved. And, think about the industry today. If you have a great artist who comes out and they put out a first album, they really don't make any money off that first album because it has to pay the advance back to the record company. So the second album is just as important as the first one. And how many bands can you think of that only had one album?
Yeah. I mean, in some of these cases, a lot of these, some of these 27 Club members and even just some other artists who die of, similar problems at a different age, some of them bring those problems with them before they even make it, before they even have that disposable income, or they're surrounded by that culture, or they're surrounded by those, vultures who are, profiting off them. They come into this with that addiction because whether it be the way they grew up, a guy like Art Alexakis from Everclear, who was a terrible drug addict until he cleaned himself up and then became famous later.
Right.
It just seems like they're bringing as many problems into the studio to start off with as they are developing later on.
Well, one of the great stories had to do with the recording of Layla, the Derek and the Dominoes album. I mean, there were stories of drugs in the studio, that at that time Clapton, Duane Allman, some of the other artists were using it. I mean, that's what Bobby Whitlock says. But Tom Dowd said that he didn't remember any drugs being used in the studio. But, you're right that artists sometimes, like Elvis, you take pills to put you to sleep, you take pills to wake you up, you take pills to give you energy. And when all this stuff is put together, I think that it creates the problem itself that, is going to lead to that destruction. You're right. Some people come in with it because they push themselves. They can't sleep. They've got to turn out something better. They've got to make a hit. I remember, I don't know if you've ever heard of Spooner Oldham, who's he's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And Dan and Spooner, let's see, I just remember that they wrote so many great songs like Cry Like a Baby and all the others, and they didn't have a title, and they didn't have a song for the box tops, and they went to a greasy restaurant, and Spooner Oldham laid his head down and said, "Man, I could just cry like a baby," and they said, "Oh, that's the song, that's the song." So they run into the studio and they record it. They start at 2 o'clock in the morning, and they get through with it by the time the box tops come. And, here it is. That's just a terrible, idea of staying up all night having to write a hit song. Now, how can you stay up all night long? You're going to take speed. You're going to take something to keep you up, to make you creative to do it. I think you're right. I think a lot of that actually adds everything to it that can lead to that early death.
Well, it's kind of like when I first found out, earlier in my life, my dream was to be a performer on Saturday Night Live. So I actually had a friend who was friendly with people on the cast and kind of told me some of the ins and outs of what went on down there. And what I didn't realize, you hear all these stories about the drug use, and you start to wonder, how can all these people have these problems? And then you realize the lifestyle that they have to live. With SNL, they show up for work on Tuesday, they start writing, and they basically live at 30 Rock until the show's over Saturday night, and they're there 24 hours a day working on all this stuff to get it ready. And it must be similar for artists. Once they get ready to go into the studio to put something out, some bands like to write in the studio, some write outside the studio, but however they work, when they start to go through that creative process, that they just must be constantly polluting themselves, whether it be for creativity purposes or longevity purposes.
Well, then you got to work with a producer, and you've got to work with a sound engineer, and what you hear in your head may not be what the producer hears in his head, so you're going to have conflict, and, to get along with somebody, and, so it creates tension, so you're right. Same thing in the music studios as it would be at SNL.
And I know with a guy like The Edge, he can never really get the sound that's in his head out onto the record because it seems like he's just more advanced than the equipment can keep up with.
Yeah, I mean, being able to get the sound in your head down is what makes you successful, which gives you that inner peace. Because you keep saying, "Well, I could have done that better. It's not how I hear it. I have to I'm compromising. I'm giving up on what I hear because studio time costs so much." And record labels aren't as forgiving about budgets as they used to be because, it's very hard to sell product now, with downloads and everything else. So it would be much, much more pressure to make it. And I think that would probably give, so bouts of depression, more pills, and put you on that downward spiral.
We might sound like a bunch of cranky music fans here when we say this, but music today is not the same as it was, especially in the late 60s, early 70s, when a lot of these artists from the 27 Club were around. But it seems like in today's music business, because album sales are so pale in comparison to what they used to be, that when something works, the industry just seems to latch onto it and milk it dry. So there's not a lot of creativity being shown, as we saw in the 60s, 70s, or even in the 90s. With all of this going on, I mean, it's hard to find an iconic figure that matches some of the legend of these members of the 27 Club. There's very few artists today. I mean, you look at somebody like Lady Gaga, who might be the biggest music artist in the world right now, but then when you take a step back and look, you're like, wow, that's just a bunch of recycled 80s crap.
That's interesting because we were talking about this earlier off air, is that, that it's something maybe having to do with that process that these current musicians don't have as many stories. And therefore, there doesn't seem to be folklore that kind of develops around them, or these stories that kind of take on legendary status, because it's created a much more of a sterile environment, and it's really hard for them to, or for us to look at them for that kind of folklore and that kind of legend status, because these stories don't come out as much and I don't know whether that's due to every little thing being automatically tweeted, so therefore there's nothing that builds, and so these things can't develop. But there doesn't seem to be those great kind of stories that go beyond just the 27 Club. Things like the planes in the graveyards and things like that.
The brown M&Ms in the brandy glass. We don't even get stories like that anymore.
We really don't. Hey, I actually did a little research while you guys were talking. I was listening, and there's a 44th member of the 27 Club, which I think might be an intentional tip of the hat to you. Gary, and that would be Charlie Pace, the bass player and songwriter for the band Drive Shaft.
Okay, right.
I didn't even think of that. Wow.
Well, you know the way my mind works. I was just got to check him, and the numbers work out that he was 27 when he died. So,
well, there you go.
With the work that they do, you have to imagine that that's probably somewhat intentional because they had to create a birthday for him.
Sure, yeah. They probably created it around that. I wish I had you all, everybody, that I could play here in the studio. But you're exactly right, Chris, though. That wall is broken down, so we can't build up these mythological stories about these artists. And just for the record, Gary, the brown M&Ms, that was Van Halen, right?
Oh, I knew that, yeah.
Okay, I because you always hear the different stories, but I remember...
And when Paul McCartney plays, you can't have any leather furniture backstage.
I'm not surprised with that, knowing his vegetarian, vegan, whatever he is.
Mm-hmm.
But I just remember hearing so many different bands attributed to the brown M&Ms that finally it wasn't until I read the actual contract rider on the Smoking Gun site. And that must be great for you to go through and read some of that stuff. I mean,
it's funny. It's good. Of course, Van Halen just put the brown M&Ms just to make sure, to see if they'd actually read the contract.
Sure, yeah. And I think the best band at it, though, going today is the Foo Fighters. Every one of theirs is like a work of art.
Yeah, I agree.
And they're one of the few bands, too. I was going to say, Dave Grohl's one of the few guys that gets it, that gets this era of music that we're talking about tonight and tries to carry some of that through into today's modern world.
Yeah, well, that's my favorite band. I love Foo Fighters. I think that one of the problems we have musically is that, I think that with the decline of regional radio, I mean, like right now, Clear Channel, you have executives in L.A. who make playlists for every station in the country, the big ones, the big FM stations. So a lot of artists are excluded. And then in the early 60s, when the British invasion and everything happened, you had those small regional DJ who would take a local band, put them on the air, and break them. And then all of a sudden they'd be nationwide. And you'd bring this sound, that was in San Francisco to Atlanta, Georgia, or a sound in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and make it worldwide. Because you had these kids who were great session players who played with Wilson Pickett and Aretha Franklin and the others, and they introduced it. I think today that may have something to do with it, because it just seems like if a label now has an artist who's a 13-year-old girl singer, every label wants a 13-year-old girl singer. Mm-hmm. And, when you take a look at originality and being creative, the creative force will last forever, but the originator, you got the originator, and then you have the people who sort of copy. And, the false version, they're going to die out. And when I listen to a lot of rock today, it seems like it's all in a formula. And it all sounds the same. I mean, vocally, sometimes musically, and there's some exceptions to the rule, but, growing up in the British invasion, you never mixed up the Beatles, the Animals, the Yardbirds, the Rolling Stones, Freddie and the Dreamers, Herman's Hermits, any of that stuff. None of that ever had anything to do with sounding like anybody else. And I think that's what made it fresh. But I think at that time it was a renaissance of sound, of new experimentation, the advent of the great guitar heroes, and we still have great musicians, great songs, great bands today, but it's a lot harder to get that big break and to become a superstar than it was back then.
I say maybe the problem, too, is we don't have enough of those artists that are live fast, die young type of mentalities, so they're not taking the same chances. They're not putting out the more experimental stuff. I mean, now it's like a band becomes established, goes through an experimental phase maybe because they get bored with the process, lose fans, and then automatically go back to that. I mean, one of my favorite bands of all time is U2, and I start to get aggravated sometimes that they don't take as many risks with the last few albums as they had in the 90s.
Yeah, well, that's true. Sometimes it's more complacent. Well, this will work. Let's put it out. And it's as opposed to what the Beatles did, because the Beatles were taking risks until they got to the White Album. So maybe it's something that happens. Maybe your muse burns out after a while.
Well, it seems like, with the passing today of Amy Winehouse, and although I'm searching the internet here and I'm not seeing anything yet about official cause of death, so I'm guessing that they're waiting for a toxicology report, which could take up to a month, I think, right?
It could. I heard someone say that they're going to try. They may even have the results tomorrow, which would be unreal if they did that. But you know what the old saying is, in England, when they find a mysterious death, they call it death by misadventure.
That sounds like this might have been the case.
Yeah. So it'll be another death by misadventure, and that means exactly what took Brian Jones and Jimi Hendrix and their investigations in England, and that's the major phrase. So we'll see if it's death by misadventure.
And we'll be hearing, I'm sure, a lot more of her music lately, and I think those that didn't appreciate her artistry will in the coming weeks as it becomes a little bit more prevalent. But, I mean, I think right from the beginning, as soon as she came out, as soon as she had that hit, Rehab, I think everybody kind of already dismissed her as being maybe the next member of this club, if not before.
Mm-hmm.
So now they'll be able to look at her in a different light, and no longer will it be, the addict that just won't get clean, but it'll be the tortured soul that was on the downward path.
Yeah, and, as I say, the only positive thing is the music's still with us.
Absolutely. So she will live on. Well, Gary, we're going to let you go so that you can get ready for Coast to Coast with Ian Punnett. Tell him that we said hello.
I'll tell him.
I'm such a huge fan of the way he handles that show, and I love every episode that you're ever on, whether it's with George or with Ian, because it just seems like when people start calling in and you start remembering all this stuff that we've been talking about here tonight, it just makes it all come back to you, and it just makes it all more real. For a guy like me that was born in '78, to hear a lot of these stories, it makes me appreciate the music that came before me more than I ever thought I could. Well,
that's great because, the story should live forever, and it should introduce you to the artist, and by introducing you to the artist, you get to hear the music, and that's the best thing. And Ian is great at it because Ian used to be a DJ, and the fun thing about Ian is he really knows music, and we've had some great times on the air, and we've had some interesting calls. I know you like the Allman Brothers, and
oh yeah,
one night I was
talking about me there.
Oh well, me too.
Oh yeah, I love the Allmans, but one night we were talking about Rose Hill Cemetery and get this call from a guy named Forrest, and he was really upset about this book on the Allman Brothers that had been written that was unauthorized. And I said, look, 99% of all books in rock and roll are unauthorized because, I don't know if you've ever worked with an artist wanting to do a book on his life, but they sort of sugarcoat everything. I told the artist that I've worked with, I said, look, if you're going to write a book, if you want me to do the book, you're going to have to admit certain things happen. You don't have to go into detail, but you don't hide it. So anyway, he went on, and we were in a break, and Ian asked me, he said, hey, you think I ought to ask him if he's still playing that red guitar? Because we believe that the guy who was calling us was none other than Forrest Dickie Betts. And we called on. We knew who it was. And it was funny, And then the next day, Ian called me, and he said that Dickie had been arrested because he had been intoxicated and had some sort of domestic assault. And I thought, oh, my God, that's because we were ribbing him, So anyway, we've had some interesting calls. We could probably do a book on the strange calls on Coast to Coast, but it's fun.
I remember I had a chance to see Dickie Betts a few years ago at the Cape Cod Melody Tent, which is a great in-the-round venue where, you're never more than 20 feet from the stage. So I go in there, and we were surprised, first of all, that Dickie Betts was actually opening for Kenny Wayne Shepherd, which I thought it was going to be the other way around, so we arrived a little bit late. When we got there, just from Dickie and his band, and I think his son was in the band, and you could just smell the weeks of riding around on a tour bus coming from the stage. Yep. But it was a phenomenal show, and it was just an experience to be able to sit there with my dad, who introduced me to their music, and and when we had you on the first time, we talked about the Allman Brothers and everything. I think it might be the only episode of our show he's ever listened to start to finish. Well, hey, I love that. I know that. I will tell you, I'll make a confession. A lot of people ask me what were the greatest concerts I ever saw. The very first concert I ever saw was like 13 years old, and I saw the original Rolling Stones. That was the first concert of my life. So I think I spent it wisely on that one.
The second concert I saw was Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs, Keith, the Royal Guardsmen, and Sam the Sham. Tommy James and the Shondells. So I sort of took a step backwards into pop rock. But one of the greatest concerts ever, besides seeing Pink Floyd, was the Allman Brothers. And you're going to love the year because it was it was 2 or 3 days before Duane Allman's overdose on opium.
Wow.
So it was at Tennessee Tech, where I went to school, and it was the original Allman Brothers. I mean, it was Barry Oakley, Duane Allman. The Live at the Fillmore album was just due to be released. They mentioned they had a live album, and I mean, they played for 3 straight hours, and it was the hottest ticket in Tennessee is to get in there and see the Allman Brothers. But I've never heard a show that was as powerful or as fabulously put together with great guitar playing as that. And that lives in my memory because I'll never forget that concert.
Well, as great as that concert must have been, I can only imagine what it must be like to see the Royal Guardsmen. What do they just play Snoopy songs for 45 minutes?
Well, you'd think so. They didn't even have the backup, you know. They just had the original Snoopy versus the Red Baron. But actually what I thought was funny, they played cover songs. I remember they did Friday on My Mind and Give Me Some Lovin'.
Oh, wow.
And, you know, so they did songs that were real popular. But, you know, the funny thing was they were really good. And the worst song they played during a concert was Snoopy versus the Red Baron. Everything else, you know, Give Me Some Lovin' sounded just like, you know, Stevie Winwood. And I was thinking, wow, these guys are good. So I guess it's a way, you know, that you get typecast because after they did that, their next song was, you know, what was it?
The Return of the Red Baron?
The Return of the
Christmas
Red Baron.
Bells, yeah.
The Christmas Bells, all that. And so they got sort of typecast into it. But, you know, they weren't bad. I know that the first guy we saw was Keith, and he had one song called 98.6.
But it's a great song.
That. Yeah, that was his only song, I guess. And then Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs were pretty strong, but of course the headliners was Tommy James and the Shondells with, I think We're Alone Now and Mirage and Hanky Panky and all of those. But that was a pretty good concert. But I guess, you know, at my age I was probably 14, so I was there with a lot of other 14-year-olds. That was my New Kids on the Block
brothers, my greatest Allman Brothers memory for you guys, really quickly too. Then, which be, I saw them 9 straight years. I missed a decade, but I saw them 9 straight years every summer. And one of the ones, I think they did a 4th or 5th one in. Diggy Betts wasn't currently on tour. He was replaced by Zakk Wylde because he was at that time on the run from the law for domestic abuse, and there was a warrant for his arrest. And so he kind of disappeared, and Zakk Wylde played. So I actually did see the Allman Brothers once with Ozzy Osbourne's guitarist instead of Diggy Betts, and it was actually amazing.
Huh, wow. That's not only is that incredible, but it's incredible looking at Dickie Betts to think that there's a woman that he could beat up. I mean, he's a skinny, scrawny dude.
Yeah, Bonnie Bramlett told me that she was singing backup with him one time, and she reached over and grabbed him from behind and lifted him up off the ground, and he got furious. And she said, I didn't know he had that much of a temper. You know, I guess he does, but, you know, wow. But I saw the Allman Brothers another time, and they opened for B.J. Thomas.
Really?
It's a strange concert.
That definitely is. Oh, man. B.J. Thomas, I mean, I'm a big Hooked on a Feeling fan, but I can't imagine that I'd be sticking around after the Allman Brothers to wait to hear that.
Well, that's true. The place emptied out very quickly.
At least maybe if it was the Blue Swede version, you know, and I got the Ooga Chuckas in there, too.
Yeah, maybe that was it. But, you know, that was a decade of what defined Southern rock, which inspired, of course, Leonard Skinner and the Outlaws and Molly Hatchet and some of the others. I will tell you quickly before we get off, one other thing I'm doing. I'm working in royalty tracking with John Hitchborn, and we're finding artists who've not been paid what they should have been paid for their hits. So if you know anyone who is an artist from the 60s, 70s, even current, they need to get in touch with us, and we'll get their money. We just represented a member of the association, and John found him $40,000 in about 3 weeks. Oh, that's not bad.
Another great couple of hits from them too. Well, if anything comes through for Tim Weisberg, the flute player, you could just send it to me. I mean, I know it's the same name, but you know, it's I'm sure there's a check out there for 75 cents for Twin Sons of a Different Mother or something for him.
It could be something like that. Just make sure you have a contract with your name on it as in the band and not just hired.
The best thing he ever did was putting out that album Tip of the Weisberg, because that gets me a lot of play, I got to say.
Yeah, okay.
All right, Gary, well, it's been great talking to you, and people can go to your website, rgarypatterson.com, as well as popodysseyradio.com, and they can switch over to Coast coming up in just a few minutes and hear you with Ian Punnett. Thanks so much for joining us and talking about the 27 Club, and hopefully it won't be so long before we have you back again.
Hey, guys, I had a great time. Thanks for having me.
All right, thank you. Have a good night.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.